This last section on viruses is how viruses can transform cells. I mentioned earlier that there are some viruses that have been known to cause cancer. So we'll talk about some ways that viruses can transform cells, as well as some other nasty acellular agents that can cause disease. So viruses can actually be teratogen. So what is a teratogen? This is something that causes defects during embryonic development, so early on during development. So if you were to work in a lab and you were working with chemicals, usually those chemicals come with material data sheets so that you know the safety precautions around them. Some of them will actually cause defects, and so they can actually be teratogens. So if you are working with a known teratogen, you want to make sure, especially if you're pregnant in the lab, that you're taking special precautions. So viruses can actually be teratogens. They can cause defects during embryonic development. So we do know that there are some diseases that pregnant women have to be mindful of. Herpes is one of those that we talked about before. This can be acquired during the birthing process. This can damage eyes and the nervous system. Rubella can cause some deafness and heart defects. CMV, cytomegalovirus, can also cause some neurological defects. I remember hearing about some diseases when I was pregnant, especially with my second child, because I had a toddler, and so toddlers are bringing home everything. And I remember hearing about Fifth's disease, that in a certain part of pregnancy, that can also be an issue. When my aunt was pregnant with her firstborn, my cousin, she was a third grade teacher. And as you know, teachers are exposed to all sorts of childhood diseases. And that year, she got a really bad flu. She was really down for the count. And her pregnancy went fine, and my cousin was born. And then when my cousin was 2 or 3, my aunt went to hand her the phone to talk to my grandmother. And my cousin said, "No, I can't hear out of this ear. I need to listen on the other ear." So my aunt thought that was peculiar, and she would ask her questions about it, and they ended up going for testing. So it turns out that my cousin is deaf in her left ear, and it was a neurological issue. My aunt claims to this day that it was more than likely caused by that terrible flu virus that she had when she was pregnant. Is it a possibility? Yes, it is a possibility, because we do know that viruses can be teratogens. Is that the likely cause? Who knows? I think the jury is still out. But I remember my aunt saying, I wonder about that bad flu virus. That's not to say that every time a pregnant woman gets sick that it is going to cause some defects. However, we do know that there are some viruses, and so this is why pregnant women may want to protect themselves. We also know that viruses can cause cancer. Cancer cells are rogue cells. They are out of control. They do not play by the normal rules of regular cells. They do not go by those cell checkpoints, the cell aging. They do not undergo apoptosis. What is apoptosis? Apoptosis is programmed cell death. So we looked at those telomeres at the end of the chromosomes when I was talking about Henrietta Lacks. Most cells, once those telomeres get to a certain length, it's time to shut off that cell division. And the cell will kind of go through apoptosis, that programmed cell death. Cancer cells will not undergo apoptosis. They just keep growing and growing and growing. Now, we do know that there are some viruses that can cause cancer. So, for example, Epstein-Barr virus can cause Burkitt's lymphoma. We did talk about human papillomavirus as causing cervical cancer as well as other types of cancer. And hepatitis B can also cause liver cancer. This is one reason that I know my practitioner was recommending her patients get the hepatitis B vaccine because of that. So we do know that viruses can cause cancer. So viruses can actually transform these cells. These cells are not going to play by the same rules. They're not going to undergo that apoptosis. So, how is it that viruses can cause cancer? So, what happens is the virus actually sneaks or integrates into the DNA and can actually get next to these on and off switches of cell division. So, tumor suppressor genes are actually on the DNA that actually act like a light switch so that they turn off cell division so that there's not uncontrolled cell growth. So viruses can actually sneak next to these tumor suppressor genes so that that switch can never be turned off. So cell division continues to happen. There are also on switches. Those are proto-oncogenes, which turns on cell division. So if a virus inserts next to that proto-oncogene, it now becomes an oncogene, and that cell division switch is left on. So in either case, if it sneaks in near this off switch or this on switch, cell division is just left on and just keeps going and going and going. And we just continuously have that cell division. The last thing that I'm going to talk about is another acellular agent that causes diseases. This kind of gives me pause because this we're not going to be able to get rid of like we would a bacteria or a virus. These are particularly nasty things that are really tough to get rid of. And these are prions, or if you prefer, prions, either pronunciation I've heard. These are proteinaceous infectious particles. These are rogue proteins, and these can cause a variety of diseases. Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease is a prion disease, and some people can get Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, which is a fatal neurological degenerative disorder. So, a very devastating diagnosis from being exposed to prions, or there are some people that can actually have these rogue proteins that just kind of develop later on in life. A few years ago, this is probably several years now, there was a story about a hospital on the West Coast where patients that had visited this particular hospital ended up with Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. So when they started to see this cluster of diseases, they actually looked into it. What they found was that all of those patients had gone for an endoscopy. And so endoscopies use like this tubing to basically look internally at a patient. And so because it's very difficult to actually clean this tubing, there was actually a prion that was introduced that by normal sterilization techniques was not able to get rid of. And so these people ended up with Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. Very devastating. There are some other prion diseases, Kuru, which is native to New Guinea. Some theorize that perhaps it was due to cannibalism. Scrapie is a prion disease in sheep. And probably the one that you've mostly heard of, or at least I've heard of, is mad cow disease. And again, this is a fatal neurological degenerative disorder. So, how is it that these prions actually cause diseases? These are aberrant, mutated proteins that don't fold correctly. They're also dominant proteins, so they can cause other proteins to fold incorrectly. Now, normal sterilization techniques do not work, so they can't be treated with high temperatures or radiation because they just are resistant to it. Things that would normally interrupt and damage nucleic acid replication are not going to work on these because they're proteins. Usually, they need some super strong chemicals, or really the best way to get rid of these things is through incineration. So if people are working with prions in the lab, basically everything needs to be incinerated because that's the only way to get rid of them. And so these are rogue proteins. So the one that you might have heard of before is mad cow disease, and this can affect cattle. Now, every once in a while, you might hear about this in the news. Fortunately, because of our regulations and the tight regulations, we don't hear about this as much, but every once in a while, you do hear about it. And in the 90s, there was a big mad cow disease outbreak in Europe. And so they were warning people if they traveled to that area to stay away from red meat because of mad cow disease. So, how is it that these cows ended up getting mad cow disease? Well, these cows were given feed that contained protein supplements, and the protein supplements actually came from the brain matter of sheep, and those sheep had scrapie, another prion disease, and then it was actually passed into the food chain. Now, the thing that is particularly scary about prions, not only do normal sterilization techniques not work, so things that we could use to get rid of bacteria and viruses don't work on prions, they are also not species specific, so they can be passed through the food chain rather quickly. And so I posted a little picture right here where you can see a normal control brain and then a brain um, with this mad cow disease. And so, again, it causes this fatal neurological degenerative disorder. So I mentioned that I worked in pharmaceuticals. And around the time that there was this mad cow disease outbreak, I actually had to travel and I had to go visit sites um, of our pharmaceutical company in different parts of Europe. And so I had to go to England and I had to go to Sweden. So we were warned about mad cow disease to stay away from beef. I called this my planes, trains, and hovercrafts tour because I had to go to tour some different sites and I took just about every mode of transportation possible. And so I managed to get through England where there was the biggest risk. I ate a lot of vegetables that trip, I will tell you that. But then I got to my last stop in Sweden, which was a lovely place. And I went to this inn. That's where I was staying. I got in very late. I hadn't eaten all day. And I went to the dining room to see if they were still serving. And the innkeeper, very nice, came up to me and said, "Oh, we just closed the dining room, but if you're hungry, we can get you something to eat." And I said, "That would be wonderful." And he said, "Well, I know you are American. I know what you'd like." I sat down, and what does he bring me? A big steak. I looked at this thing in horror because I'd managed the entire trip to avoid beef as I'd been instructed. And I looked at it and I hesitated. I thought, oh my gosh, what do I do? Do I offend the innkeeper? I was also starving. So what to do? What to do? Well, I ate the steak, and I'm happy to report I did not get prion disease. I did not get mad cow disease. Although sometimes it can take several years, but it has been many years since I did not get mad cow disease. It was a big sigh of relief. It was, a little stressful, but at the time, it was a real concern. Every once in a while, we do hear about Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. If you ever know any patients to suffer from it, it's a horrible, horrible disease. And we do hear about mad cow disease from time to time, but fortunately, we have some good regulations to help prevent that.